Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kristen Motti, a programs librarian here at the Central Library of the Boston Public Library. Tonight, our featured author, Haroon Moghul, will discuss his new book, 2 Billion Caliphs, A Vision of a Muslim Future. We'll meet Haroon in just a moment. First, a few reminders. We're in a webinar space, so in this space, cameras and microphones are muted. We do want to hear from you, though, so you can type your questions at any time during the presentation in the Q&A box, and we will have time at the end for questions. You will see some relevant links go out in the chat too. So you can check there for how to buy the book and websites and other information relevant to today's program. Subtitles and closed captioning can be turned on or off by the live transcript button in the corner of your screen. And a recording of this program will be available on our websites in the coming weeks. To buy a copy of tonight's featured book, 2 Billion Caliphs, you can order from our partner bookseller, Trident Booksellers, and they will ship nationwide. And we'll be putting the link in the chat in just a moment, so you can see there how to get a copy, or try your local library and borrow it from them. Now for a welcome from our partner, the State Library of Massachusetts, and to introduce tonight's author, here is Beth Carroll Horrocks from the State Library of Massachusetts. Beth, welcome.
Thank you, Kristen, and hello, everyone. A quick greeting from the State Library of Massachusetts, where I am the head of special collections. So the virtual format of these author talks during the pandemic has brought the State Library a whole new audience for author talks, and we're especially grateful to be here tonight with our partners, again, from the Boston Public Library. So tonight's conversation with Haroon Moghul will be a special treat for those of us who are interested in a topic that many of us unfortunately know little about. So Haroon Moghul was born in New England to parents who had moved here from Pakistan and worked as medical professionals. He's an award-winning author, commentator, and it says on his website, in quotes, occasional preacher, wrote book-length works, whose book-length works include My First Police State, The Order of Light, How to Be a Muslim, An American Story, and the book we're discussing today, 2 Billion Caliphs, A Vision of a Muslim Future. One biographical statement describes him as passionate about the role of faith in building a better human future. And that really touched me, and I hope we hear more about that today. So his essays and articles have been published by numerous websites, including the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, NPR's Fresh Air, Religion Dispatches, Time. There's many, many more. He's been a guest on many television shows, including the History Channel, BBC, NPR, and Al Jazeera English. So his current residence is in Ohio, but his voice is heard all over the world. So let's get started. Haroon?
Hi, good evening, everyone. I am, of course, Haroon. It's an honor to be here. Really grateful to Boston Public Library and the State Library of Massachusetts, especially meaningful given that I was born in Massachusetts, albeit on the western end of the state, and spent the first 10 years of my life in Massachusetts, and remains important to me beyond that connection. The mosque I attended that had such an important part in shaping my initial relationship to Islam is located in West Springfield, Massachusetts, and actually had the chance to go back there in Ramadan at the end of April to visit and see how remarkably the community, the congregation, and even the physical space itself had changed. Of course, I'm here tonight to talk about a book, 2 Billion Caliphs, A Vision of a Muslim Future, which very much emerges out of the story of my life as it began in New England and took shape in the Northeast. As Beth mentioned, I'm now in Cincinnati, Ohio. That's a pretty recent move, but I grew up in a very small town where I was the only Muslim student, certainly, and there wasn't much in the way of diversity, including religious diversity. There was one other Jewish student. And so I found myself very much in the position of being a religious ambassador, wittingly or not. And I'm sure a lot of people who come from different faith traditions or ethnic backgrounds can absolutely relate to this. And I found myself frequently in the position of having to explain or convey an understanding of why things were a little bit different in terms of my family and why I could and certainly couldn't do a lot of things because of the restrictions my parents might have placed on me. And that was all pretty benign, to be absolutely honest. I'd never really encountered any specific maliciousness or malevolence or anything of the kind. It was just the case that my religion was extremely unfamiliar. Fast forward, and I went to college in New York City. I wanted a big city, but I wanted to be close enough to home that I could go back to do important things like laundry, which is always hard to do in New York, no matter how old you are. And tragically, during my senior year, the 9/11 attacks took place. And suddenly that role of being an ambassador and an interlocutor and essentially an explainer turned into something far more urgent, vital, necessary, and difficult, where suddenly the United States, it seemed, became aware of Islam, and certainly not in a good way. And I found myself in a position of having the ability to explain difficult parts of Islam, in part because of the fact that I came from a religious background and a scholarly family where many of these things were discussed from a very young age. And so I spent pretty much the last 20 years trying to explain Islam to audiences that were often unfamiliar with the faith and many times, unfortunately, though not surprisingly, hostile to the faith, or at least suspect of the faith. And so a few years ago, I reached out to my publisher, Beacon Press, and said, what if I write an introduction to Islam to help people understand a faith that they should understand, but maybe don't understand? And really the case for that is something that I think I can make for several reasons. The first is Islam as a major world religion deserves to be better understood simply for the sake of understanding the world we live in, and certainly because of the importance of Islam in the world. So the title of the book is 2 Billion Caliphs, and that's of course a direct reference to the fact that there are almost around about 2 billion Muslims in the world. According to Pew Research surveys, it probably by the year 2070, which is not too far away, about 33% of the world population will likely affiliate in some way, shape, or form with Islam as a religion, which means 1 out of 3 people in the world will somehow be connected to Islam, a proportion that will be about equivalent to Christianity. And certainly in the West, and especially in Europe, Islamic affiliation in terms of demographic trends is growing, not as extremely as some of the more alarmist voices would put it in very negative and dark terms, but certainly in the sense of growing Muslim communities and increasingly public conversations about Islam. It's estimated that by 2070, about 1 in 10 Europeans will somehow be connected to Islam. And in the United States, about 2% of the population, maybe around about 6-7 million people, will be Muslim. Of course, in the United States, that's not a lot of people, but it's an increase from where we are now. So understanding Islam is really important to understanding not only the history of the world's religions, but the world demographically and geographically, as it'll be increasingly in decades to come. But when I surveyed the literature on introductions to Islam, I found a problem. And the problem was that many people, relatively speaking, had done a pretty good job trying to explain the whys, the hows of Islam or the what of Islam. So sort of, this is how Muslims pray, or this is where Muslims make pilgrimage, or these are the important dates in the Islamic calendar, whether in terms of ritual observance or simply a chronology of Islam. Here are definitions of key terms that you may have heard and possibly misunderstood, but there was very little in the way of trying to explain the attraction of Muslims to their faith. What I mean is there was very little attempt to explain why Muslims did the things they did. And I will say as an aside, I think that this is a calling for scholars, journalists, teachers, professors, community leaders, broadly speaking across America in a time of increasing polarization. We don't do a very good job of trying to understand the deep motivations that impel people to vote, to act, to affiliate, and to prioritize the way they do. And so it's one thing to say, Muslims pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. It's another thing to say, here's why Muslims pray, and here's what they hope to get out of it, and here's how prayer fits into their worldview. And it's fundamentally important because we can't understand why people respond to challenges and scenarios in sometimes diametrically opposite ways if we don't understand their baseline motivation. So I said to myself, I want to write a book that really gets to the heart of what it means to be Muslim. And of course, as I was writing, because it took several years, as I suppose someone who writes slowly would, a couple things happened. The first is it occurred to me that actually what I was writing wasn't just of interest and relevant to a mainstream audience. It was actually really important for Muslims, especially Muslims in North America and the West, who might be disconnected from their heritage or simply looking to find a relationship to Islam on their own terms and in our own context, which, as Beth had pointed out, I was raised in a family of Pakistani origin. Certainly the life circumstances I faced and the realities I confronted in my youth were very different than what my parents faced. I mean, from the very basic and simple fact that they lived in a society where nearly everyone was Muslim, and moreover, from the same ethnic group as they were. And here I was, one of about 400 kids in a high school where pretty much everyone was white and in some way, shape, or form connected to a Christian tradition, spiritually speaking. So I realized I had a book on my hands that was important to understanding Islam, but it was also important to understanding Islam for Muslims to find a new relationship to Islam. And so what I started to do was look into what are the key concepts and ideas that would help Muslims discover a new relationship to our faith. I don't mean a complete overturning of the faith, but simply the chance to dig deep, to excavate, and to determine whether we wanted to or needed to do things exactly in the way that they had been handed down to us. And some people may read this and come to the conclusion that, yes, we are moving in the right direction. And other people may read this and come to the conclusion that, no, actually, there's a lot of daylight between how we are taught Islam and what Islam actually or potentially makes possible or wants out of us. And what I'm going to do here very briefly, because I know this is a huge topic demographically and chronologically and in every way, I'm going to try to touch on one of these concepts that I think is especially important to understanding not only the book, but the future of Islam, as well as the history of Islam. And I know that's a big claim. So I am going to say as a preamble that when we get to questions, and I hope we'll have ample time for questions, please feel free to ask anything that's on your mind related to the topic. If I can answer it, I will. If I can't, I will just politely point out that it's not in my wheelhouse, but I encourage you to ask questions on any topic related to Islam, even if it doesn't seem immediately germane to what I'm talking about here, because I would like to have the opportunity to have those conversations. So that said, the title of the book is 2 Billion Caliphs. And essentially, it's a way of drawing our attention to a widely misunderstood term. And the term, of course, is caliph. And what I'm going to do here in terms of explaining and then in reading a direct passage from the book is talk about the original meaning of the term caliph and how it's relevant to understanding Islam in the future in terms of what Islam could be, and I'll argue a little bit more, perhaps with a little bit of audaciousness, what Islam should be and could be. So as a way of framing this conversation, what's interesting about the Muslim experience is that for the last 20 years, almost anywhere you've lived as a Muslim, you've had in some way, shape, or form had to effectively understand your identity against the backdrop of the war on terror. This militarized, weaponized binary, sometimes emerging from within Muslim communities and sometimes being imposed from without by actors outside the community, whatever it was, there were very few places in the world where in some way, shape, or form, you were not impacted, if you were Muslim, by the framing of us versus them, by a very black or white, inside or outside understanding of Islam. And in the last year, from the withdrawal of American forces in Afghanistan and the fall of Kabul in August of last year, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, or I should say the next phase of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, that framing has become less and less relevant, if relevant at all, to mainstream America. We have effectively ended the post 9/11 era and moved on to something new. And what that means is that for the first time in 20 years, Muslims all over the world have more room to navigate really difficult questions about who we want to be in the decades to come. And what I'm arguing in this book is that any successful vision of Islam for the future has to be grounded in this idea of caliphate, and not in the way that it's popularly understood, but in an earlier understanding of the term that emerges directly from the Quran. So to do this, I'm going to give you a little bit of history. It might be a little unfamiliar. It might be a little overwhelming. I'm hoping it's not too unfamiliar. And of course, if something's unclear, I invite you to ask questions and we can unpack it a little bit in the course of Q&A. So the primary religious figure in the Islamic tradition is the Prophet Muhammad. And customarily, Muslims will, after mentioning his name directly or indirectly, say, peace be upon him, in whatever language we are most comfortable with. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, lives between the years 570, roundabout, and 632, which is kind of a blank period in Western history as it's usually told, right? It's after the fall of Rome, or at least the Western Roman Empire, and well before the beginning of the Renaissance. And so it's this kind of spot where we don't really look at too closely, never mind in Europe, certainly in the rest of the world. And yet it's one of the most influential periods in world history, given the significance of the Prophet to the development of Islam. Yet when the Prophet Muhammad dies in the year 632, immediately, literally within hours of his passing, the seeds of the emergence of the Sunni and Shia identities, the primary sectarian categories of Islam, right? The sort of equivalent, though not perfectly, to Protestant and Catholic, or maybe Orthodox and conservative, depending on how you want to look at it. It's by no means an exact analogy. I'm just inviting you to think about sectarian differences within perhaps traditions that are more familiar. But in 632, within hours of the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the community begins to fragment. And effectively, one of the answers the community comes up with to what do we do now? Who is in charge now? Is the Sunni answer, which is an office of the Caliphate, which is a political institution. But the term was actually borrowed from the Quran. And the Quran actually mentions the Caliphate in a completely different sense. In the Quran, the first caliph is actually Adam, and then Eve, as in the Abrahamic tradition, the first people. And the title caliph effectively means something like a steward or a custodian or a representative. And what it means is that every human being, beginning with Adam and Eve, is created to be a representative of God on earth. Not in a political sense, in a theological and moral and creative sense, that we are delegated a certain kind of authority as individuals, regardless of who we are, our gender, our wealth, our class, our race, our ethnicity, what religion we are, whether we even follow a religion. It doesn't matter. As long as you're a human being, you are, in theory and potential, a caliph of God. And the reason I think this is so important, well, there's actually a few reasons. The first is that it explains one of the challenges of Islamic history. And the second is it actually does a really good job preparing Muslims for the challenges of the future. So the idea of caliphate, the individual theological caliphate, I'm not talking about a political office. This is not a call for any kind of intervention in that realm. It's a call for us to understand what it means to be a human being on a deep spiritual and fundamental and basic level in the Islamic tradition. Going back to what I was saying about how my book is trying to help us understand what motivates Muslims to do the things they do, not just what we do, but why we do those things. So the idea of this caliphate of God on earth, embedded in and adhering in and existing as all human beings who've ever lived and ever will live, helps us understand a challenge in Islamic history and gives us a promising vision of a Muslim future. And I'll break those down briefly before reading a passage from the book. So with respect to the first, to the question of the challenges of the past, one of the most interesting things Muslims struggle with that seems peculiarly challenging for Islamic history is that despite in many respects being a religion with a remarkable amount of convergence on key ideas and practices and texts and traditions, Muslims seem to be unusually divided among themselves. And anyone who's studied the history of the last few hundred years of Muslim societies notes that there's constant waves of interest in unifying and connecting and empowering Muslims as Muslims, followed by sharp periods of disunity. And one of the things my book asks Muslims to do, and a mainstream audience to at least understand, is that actually this kind of divisiveness or this kind of fragmentation is a design feature of Islam. It's not a problem Muslims face so much as an inevitable consequence of our theology. Because you see, the reason Sunni and Shia Muslims started dividing, or that there are even Sunni and Shia Muslims in the first place, is because when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passed away, it was not clear who was going to be in charge next. And the reason for that is simple. In the Islamic tradition, we believe that God selected individuals across time and space to receive revelation, including people like Noah and Abraham and Moses and Jesus and John the Baptist and finally Muhammad. And yet Muhammad is the last of these. And so after Muhammad, there is no further revelation, which means that there is no person and no body that can ever conclusively decide on a new issue in the absence of the Prophet Muhammad. Because if they had that authority, if they were able to do that, they would be a prophet. And since that's functionally blasphemous in the Islamic tradition, in effect, Islam is inviting a permanent conversation, or sometimes argument, on what the right thing to do is in any situation. During the life of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims could simply go to the Prophet and believed that any answer they received to a question or a concern can be no person who will ever do that, whoever can do that. And so Muslims are thrown back on our own moral agency, that we are effectively called on to be responsible for living out divine commands as best as we can. And so what this means is that any attempt we have to cooperate and collaborate requires us to acknowledge that at the end of the day, each of us is on our own accountable for what we do and don't do. And if we fail to acknowledge that, we will be endlessly surprised by the fact that it is hard to form consensus. And it is precisely hard to form consensus because Muslims believe that at the end of the day, we cannot pass the buck morally, theologically, and eschatologically speaking. And so we have a lot of volatility. Now, moving to the second point I was making is that I actually think this is exactly something, instead of fighting against this, Muslims should be embracing this because it's actually perfectly designed for the future we seem to be headed for. Not only do we have a world of greater and greater diversity and pluralism, but we have a world that is changing faster and faster. And so in a situation where things are changing faster and faster, there is less need for and less relevance for static hierarchies and more need for dynamic and creative approaches to religion, which go back to individual agency, creativity, and autonomy. And so what this book is calling for, at least one of the things this book is calling for, is an idea that we put more energy in local and especially individual moral agency and spend less and less of our time worrying about totalizing, collectivizing, even nationalizing visions of religion. Not only are those unlikely to succeed, they are fundamentally alien to the core Islamic ethos, which is that each individual is individually accountable to the divine. And this is a concept that is told in the Islamic tradition from the very beginning of human history, beginning with the story of Adam and Eve. And so the section I'm going to read before we move to Q&A is from the 5th chapter of my book. It's called Anakin Skywalker is the Devil. That part will be explained if you read the book. But it's essentially a retelling of this foundational story, the story of the Garden of Eden, in the Islamic tradition. And so it opens with, or it opens, the selection I'm reading opens right after God informs the universe effectively that he is creating a caliph, a representative on earth, and then creates Adam and Eve and places them in the Garden of Eden, where we come across a figure identified in the Islamic tradition as Satan, who is, among other things, quite envious that he was not accorded the status of caliph and that Adam and Eve were instead. So I'm going to read from that. I'm just going to pause 1 second to produce the passage and read it. And again, if you do want to find the original passage, it's in chapter 5 of the book. So I'm just gonna open with that. Sorry. But Satan whispers in Adam's ear, or in Adam's ears and Eve's, and convinces them to eat from the tree they were forbidden to eat from. Shall I lead you, he says, to a tree and to a kingdom that never decays? It's an odd invitation, given that Adam and Eve are already immortals in an undying garden. But maybe Satan was just an outstanding salesman. Maybe he's promising them something more. Maybe they just want to know what had happened if they ate from the tree. Species, because Adam and Eve, as we expect, eat from the tree. On taking a bite, Adam and Eve become aware of their nakedness. They were conscious, and suddenly they feel the sting of conscience. And God confronts them. He knows what they've done, but must still voice his disappointment and explain what must happen next. They are to be cast out to live lives on earth full of hunger and need, but he doesn't entirely abandon them either. He teaches them words of repentance, which they repeat, and they are, like that, absolved. They made a mistake, recognized their lapse in judgment, apologized. God doesn't say they can come back to the garden, that everything will go on like before, but he does wipe their slates clean. The consequences of the error are inherited by all people, but the error itself will not count against them in the afterlife. Their descendants will be born blemishless. Islam has no original sin. Jesus is our Messiah, but does not need to die for anyone's sins. All we must do when we go astray is ask God for forgiveness. And we know how to because God teaches us how. He promises to be in touch with Adam and Eve from time to time and their progeny, the origin of prophethood. God teaches the same basic truths to people from every time and place, the broad outlines that Muslims believe inform the original editions of all the faiths. Hence, among many others, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and John the Baptist were Muslims of a kind. But before we get ahead of ourselves, God being God, he already knew they'd fall. He already knew they'd fail. Remember what God said to the angels before? I am making on the earth a caliph. But God made Adam and Eve in the garden. When the angels said, will you make one who sheds blood and causes corruption, in response, they could not have imagined when God replied, I know and you do not know. Adam and Eve are only exiled to earth when they land disoriented and confused on the planet we now call home. The one the angels should have been worried about was the worshipful one who is treated as one of them. You might understand the story from a different perspective if you relate it to how many science fiction movies flip our sense of causality. Satan, worshipful and obedient, gains access to long life. But upstaged by Adam and Eve, the caliphate usurped, especially galling since other caliphs appear to have failed before Adam, Satan sets out to prove Adam and Eve aren't worthy of the promised title. Satan causes Adam to fall, but it is the fall that leads to earth, and it's on earth that the couple were meant to be caliphs. Satan's desire to deny Adam and Eve the caliphate is the very thing that causes Adam and Eve to become caliphs. God never told the angels that humans won't be flawed. He tells them instead that there's more to the story. What distinguishes Adam and Eve from Satan is not agency or innocence. Adam and Eve made a mistake. Right after being told exactly what not to do, they went ahead and did it. But unlike Satan, who vows after his disobedience to prove God wrong, a strange strategy since the latter is literally omniscient, Adam and Eve fess up. That is what makes humans caliphs. Not that we don't make mistakes, because we will falter, fail, hurt, and wound, but because we can make up for it. Our repentance doesn't change the harm we cause, but in admitting our wrong, we return to the stature God wanted for us. Perfection is reserved for God, and in admitting our imperfection, we understand who God is and who we are not. To know oneself is to know one's limitations, and to know one's limitations is to know the limitless. As God elsewhere told the Prophet Muhammad, "I was a hidden treasure who wished to be known." Adam never had what Satan had. He lacked all those powers and abilities. His strength was his ability to be honest about himself. And what I find so vitally necessary about this story is that in this foundational narrative of who human beings are in the Islamic tradition, every step of the way, the story only makes sense if Adam and Eve have individual agency and accountability. That, I would argue, is a part of the Islamic tradition that explains how Islamic history has unfolded in the world. But it also suggests how Islam should operate in a future that is changing faster and faster than any institutional, let alone governmental attempt to contain it ever could. With that, we'll turn to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Haroon.
Go ahead, Kristen. Well, thank you, Haroon. You filled in many gaps in my knowledge about the rest of the world. So we do have several questions for you. And since we're librarians, some of them relate to the writing and selling of the book. So I'm going to start with the first one that you've partly addressed already, and that is, who exactly was this book written for? Did that audience, the audience you had in mind, change while you were writing it? Especially interested in knowing if you know who buys the book.
Sure. When I set out to write the book, and it's a great question because I think authors would like to think that we are much more intentional and strategic and focused on such things. When I started to write the book, certainly I had in mind an idea that it would be a book that would especially appeal to younger Americans who were open to a different perspective, college students perhaps, did a lot of work on college campuses, and a general American public for whom there wasn't a lot of access to really rigorous and thoughtful conversations about Islam. And certainly when I started writing the book, the frame we lived in, the war on terror, the 9/11 era, was much more salient, I would argue, than it is now. As I was writing, I got a sense that more and more there was a lot there that I wanted to share with young Muslims. And on a personal note, I'll add that I got married not too long ago and became a stepdad. And that shift in my world really got me thinking about what continuity means. And I've found a lot of these conversations to be so much more important on a really personal level, because I think to myself, what did my parents try to pass on to me? What should I try to pass on? What's worth passing on? And what does it mean to pass something on? Are we passing on information? Are we passing on capability? Are we passing on attachment? Are we passing on identity? Are we passing on morality? And really, I feel like I've kind of gone back to the starting point and am looking at these perspectives and ideas in an entirely new light. In terms of who's buying the book, I am finding one thing that's really heartening is I'm finding a lot of interest from Muslims in other Western countries where I think the conversation about Islam isn't quite as rich and nuanced as it is in the United States. We tend to have a very lively religious marketplace, shall we say, and not so much the case in other places. And so I'm actually hearing from publishers who want to translate the book into other languages spoken in Europe, for example. And I didn't see that coming, but that's certainly one of the nicer things I've received.
It's a good thing, yes.
Yeah.
Kristen?
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about how the focus of the book changed during the pandemic and what in your life maybe influenced those changes as you were writing the book?
Sure. Well, so I most immediately and kind of, I guess, bluntly, the book was delayed by the pandemic. And so, initially we were planning to publish about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, something like that. And then we kind of paused and said, let's see how this unfolds. And then, we said to ourselves, as myself and the publisher, that maybe we should wait till the 2020 election and see what happens, because we don't want the book to age really rapidly depending on who wins, or I suppose who people think won. Since that's a thing we now have to say, I never really thought I'd be in that stage in American history, but all the same, I think it's, in a way, it made the book feel scarier to put out there, but even more urgent in that, at least, and I acknowledge that in many respects, I had a really privileged childhood. I really did. But even then, I think a lot of the things that we worry about as Americans now, we didn't have to worry about 20 or 30 years ago, in many respects, right? Questions of continuity. It feels like we have a much more erratic and polarized political culture. We do have a much more erratic and polarized political culture. And so, and COVID really underscored that in the sense that the world does change very quickly now. And we lack for sources of continuity and stability. And I think that only underscores the need to develop certain attitudes and perspectives that enable people to act confidently in rapidly changing circumstances. And so for young Muslims, what I hope is that the book gives them access to stories of Islam that transmit values, not outcomes, not policy prescriptions, not bullet points and plans for action, so much as what are the things that we are cultivating in ourselves, with the understanding that each individual generation and each community will have to determine what that actually means in translation. And I did get some pushback from folks who said, well, you didn't lay out what we're supposed to do next. And I have to very politely point out that that's actually not the point. It's actually defeating the point. Like, I don't want to tell you what to do next. What I want to tell you is you need to decide for yourselves what to do next, and stop looking for people in, positions of authority to tell you what to do next.
Thank you.
Okay. So every once in a while, I see invitations on different library listservs, or there's even a Facebook page inviting people to programs called Talk to a Muslim. And do you have any sense if these are just individuals offering these programs, or if there's a larger coordinated effort? I believe it started actually right here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, outside of our public library. That's what I've read.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a coordinated effort. What I will say is that there's a lot of, the American Muslim community is it's an interesting community. In some ways, it's remarkably diverse and incredibly fragmented, but it's also a very small community that was facing, especially in the last 20 years, a lot of very similar challenges and assumptions and conversations in a country that's in many respects very culturally homogenous, in terms of our national conversation. We have some, obviously the internet has fragmented things, but there are a few networks and, a few big newspapers and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of replication. I don't know if that was necessarily in the sense of deliberate, organized effort, so much as, hey, a bunch of Muslims over here are doing that, maybe we should do that too. And there's a lot of convergent evolution as well, where people in different contexts come up with the same idea because it's it's a pretty good idea. You mentioned the Talk to a Muslim, the local mosque here that I attend, not as often as I should, but the Islamic Center of Greater Cincinnati has been doing for many years a talks and tours program where basically they just invite people from the community. It's kind of an open house, and effectively you talk to a Muslim, in a mosque, and learn a little bit about Islam. And I actually, on my birthday, did one of those in Australia, which was kind of fun. And the first question I got asked, which I don't know if it says anything about Australia, but since I'm often generalized about, I'm just going to generalize about people in turn. The first question I got was, have you ever been in a bar fight? And I was like, well, first of all, as a Muslim, I can't publicly admit to being in a bar. But, right. But, I was like, actually, no, I've never been in a fight. I write books. I'm probably not the kind of person you want on your side in a fight. But unless it's a rhetorical fight, in which case I'll deliver several cutting remarks. But, I mean, it's a kind of a fun experience. And I'm grateful for having had that chance. And I think for a young community, relatively speaking, that was often the best we could do. We didn't really have a lot of resources to put into the, pushing back against a lot of the marginalization. We just had a lot of enthusiasm and passion and tried to do the best we could.
Okay.
We have received a question from Greg, and he's asking if you could clarify the role of women in Islam, because most people probably have a misunderstanding of how women are seen in the past and also currently. If you could address that question.
Yeah, so that's a major theme in the book, and it is true. I don't think it's something that should be denied or certainly not overlooked by any means, that there is a lot of misogyny in Muslim spaces. It's certainly not to the extent that it is sometimes caricatured in some of the conversations we have, and there's tremendous amounts of variability. But there is a lot of misogyny in Muslim spaces. Sometimes this is conscious and intentional. Other times it is inherited and simply reproduced without much thought. And we sometimes internalize practices or behaviors without really thinking about how they affect people, let alone generationally. I think that with the destabilization of older ways of doing things for Muslims, one of the upsides to that is that people are finally critically engaging with some of these practices and traditions. And what I try to do in the book is retell the story of Islam in such a way that foregrounds the remarkable role played by women in the Islamic tradition. And again, sometimes for people that it still comes across as strange, unless we remember that these were kinship-based societies in which relationships and blood lineage were incredibly significant. So wives, sisters, cousins, those kinds of relationships in every direction, husbands, sons, that's how politics unfolded, right? In most societies until very recently, it was simply, that was just how we constructed power and authority. I will say from a personal level, it's always been a little strange to me because I do come from a scholarly family. My grandfather and great-grandfather were, for lack of a better term, somewhat akin to clerical figures, and spoke Arabic and Persian and the classical languages of Islamic culture in India. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, had 7 daughters and no sons. And it's a testimony, and his world is gone, to put it mildly, right? The reality that he inhabited and represented is gone. And I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. He made sure all of his daughters were educated and markedly so. So my mother, for example, was a doctor. And there were not a lot of female doctors in Pakistan when she grew up, but she did it. She persevered. She faced a lot of pushback, I'm sure. And she was also very well educated in the Islamic tradition. And I inherited my passion for writing and for learning and for arts and culture from her, and she from him. And so in Punjabi culture, women often play a very powerful role. It's sometimes not noted or understood, but it's undeniable to anyone who lives in those contexts. It was funny because I remember when my grandfather, and he passed away some years ago, would see, or would read stories about extremist groups. He wouldn't just look at them with a sense of disgust. He would look at them with a sense of sadness, because he actually had training in the Islamic tradition, right? He wasn't looking at it in the sense of, an outsider thinking how horrible. he was looking at as an insider saying, what is happening to the world that I am a part of? And it's this kind of decay that tragically I think is familiar now to a lot of Americans, where if we look at the kind of political discourse we have now versus even a few years ago, there's been a marked decline in how we speak about each other. And I think that hurt him very much and was very hard for him to deal with. But it also, I mean, if there's a silver lining, gave me a sense of confidence that is not what our religion is. And I know that because I've seen something better, and I certainly don't believe it doesn't have authority. And my mother had a very impactful role in educating Muslim men and women in Western Massachusetts. And, I tried to honor that in the book. Yeah. I hope that answers Greg's question. I know it's a big question, but I tried to do it as best as I could.
Thank you for that.
Okay. So you've talked a fair amount tonight about how many non-Muslim Americans don't understand the difference between the so-called that small minority of so-called terrorist bad Muslims and the much larger group of people who live by a more love-based faith. And I don't really have a sense of what the percentage of Americans who think in one way or the other is. So the question is, have you noticed any difference after your move from New York to Cincinnati in people's understanding of the Muslim faith?
So I will say, as a sort of an anecdote I often used to share when I was, asked this question, is that Pew did a survey on how warm or cold Americans felt towards certain, I guess for lack of a better term, faith identities or moral frames. And the most popular, or the warmest feelings were reserved for Jewish Americans, and the coldest were for atheists and Muslims, where about 40% of Americans, roughly, this is I think several years ago, had warm feelings towards atheists and Muslims. And I used to tell people that this made me feel very sad, until I realized that made Muslims about 4 times more popular than Congress. So it was it was definitely disheartening, but there was some consolation to be had in that, at least we weren't Ted Cruz and Paul Ryan. But, that said, it's an interesting question. And I think I'll share 2 anecdotes that suggest how strange this moment is for a Muslim like myself. My formative experience in my Muslim identity was 9/11, right? I was 21 years old. I was in New York City. We were within walking distance of the towers when the attacks happened. We saw the towers burning. And regardless of where people were, anyone who lived through that day, especially as an American, it had a profound and decisive impact on the trajectory of your understanding of the world. And I think that the conversation has changed and we haven't caught up to it, including within Muslim communities. So many of the people who appointed themselves Muslim leaders in the last 20 years still revolved around a frame of a post 9/11 era, missing the fact that new populations of Muslims were coming and new understandings of what it meant to be an American Muslim were forming. And we kind of got our own rude awakening in the same way that many Americans woke up in November 2016, shocked that Trump had won, right? Many American Muslims woke up in 2020 shocked. And this is still surprising to people that 1 out of 3 American Muslims in 2020 voted for Trump, which is not what you would expect. And certainly, right? And I see that here, and I see that in suburbs across America, where sizable numbers of American Muslims voted for Trump and vote for Republican candidates. And, there's lots of reasons for that, and that can be unpacked, for hours on end. But that's the landscape. And it's something that's been talked about more broadly, where, people on the left have pointed out, for example, that, many Hispanic voters, for example, moved rightwards in the 2020 election, right? We saw this, right? That support among communities of color for Joe Biden dipped in certain places or shifted in certain places versus 2016. And that's a long conversation. But, I haven't seen the latest results, but I know that the Pennsylvania primary was yesterday. And Mehmet Oz, it appears that he won the Republican primary, although maybe like by, a hair. And he's of Muslim ancestry, he's Turkish. And actually in the book, I mentioned that, one day there will be a Muslim senator. And I certainly wouldn't have expected that possibly he would be a Trump endorsed Muslim senator, right? Like that never had even entered my imagination that like that would be the person, right? The first two Muslims in Congress were African-American Democrats. And that's not surprising given the incredible significance of African-Americans to American Muslim history. And now, of course, we have Rashida Tlaib, who's of Palestinian origin, and Ilhan Omar, both congresswomen who, Michigan and Minnesota respectively, and she's of Somali ancestry. And they represent immigrant origin Muslim communities, right? And now there's potentially a Muslim Republican senator, right? But that's also weird because this is the same candidate who said he wanted to ban Muslim immigration to the United States and then literally nominates or throws his weight behind, I should say, a Muslim immigrant, right? So like, what does that mean, right? And I think that it's just a very confusing time in the American Muslim community. And what I'll end with saying is that according to pretty solid research, Islam may be the most ethnically diverse religious community in the United States. And it is very likely the most ethnically diverse Muslim nationality in the world. And so we are very small in terms of the global Muslim community. We're gonna have 2 billion people, like 3 million are American. That's not, I can't do the math because I'm a humanities guy, but it's not a lot of people, right? But at the same time, the diversity packed within that 3 million, maybe 5 million is astonishing. And I'm just, I'm still trying to make sense of it. What that means for the future, I have no idea.
I have a really quick follow-up to that question, and that is what happened, excuse me, to that community center in that was being planned in 2020 for a location near the World Trade Center.
Sure.
And its community.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with what's happened in the last couple of years, but I will say that when it was originally announced, it kind of became a little bit of a chicken and the egg kind of problem, where when it was announced, it was this idea that a Muslim community center and worship space would be built in Lower Manhattan. For those who don't know, New York City is home to about 20% of America's Muslims. There's about 800,000 Muslims in New York City, about 10 to 12% of the population, 13% of the public schools are Muslim kids. It's the largest Muslim city in the Western Hemisphere. So the need for a Muslim community center is undeniable. Whether it should have been in Lower Manhattan, I don't even mean for symbolic reasons, simply geographic reasons, right? Most Muslims lived in Brooklyn and Queens, not in Manhattan. And so how useful a space in Lower Manhattan would have been to communities, who lived, on the other side of the river is a debatable question, right? But of course, it quickly became a conversation about sacred concepts and who gets to build where and what is the status of Islam in American life, all of which was very unfortunate and very disheartening. But effectively, from a simple kind of logistical frame, when it was announced, it was a concept. And the problem became that they needed to raise money. And nobody wanted to donate money because nobody wanted to be dragged through the mud. Anyone who lives through that, remember that the media firestorm was insane. And there's not that many, insanely wealthy American Muslims who can throw down $10, $20 million for a project like that. Certainly not, the majority of American Muslims aren't in that economic profile or demographic, I should say. But the way it was presented suggested that it already had the money. And so it became this thing that in the eyes of critics, deliberately or not, it was presented as, basically a done deal. Whereas in fact, the money wasn't there. They were looking for the money. And, they had to have impressive plans to excite someone enough to give, substantial amounts of money. But then it was the scale of the plans that itself drew attention. And I think, it underscores also how unfamiliar a lot of Americans are with New York. I remember people panicking that it was going to be 13 stories. And I was like, have you been to Lower Manhattan, right? 13 stories basically means you're going to be in the shade every day of the year, right? Like most of the buildings are 60 or 70 stories, right? So like you're effectively talking about a building that no one's even going to notice. Other people would say, why can't they build it a mile away? And you're like, well, because a mile away is the Atlantic Ocean, right? So you can't, unless you want to build in the ocean, in which case you have to be slightly more than 13 stories, not going to work. So it was a case where the ambitions and hopes of a growing community were really just crushed by a lot of bigotry, a lot of hate, and a lot of intolerance. And I think that there are still plans. There's still a community there. They still worship. There are plans to move forward in some way, shape, or form. I'm not familiar with them, but it definitely scared a lot of American Muslims and basically told us we don't belong here.
Well, it's one of many fascinating stories that I think people will love to read about.
Thank you.
So we have time for one more question.
We can do one more question. Jean asks, are you familiar, Haroon, with the poet Khalil Gibran's description of Islam to the American Academy of Religion in 1916?
I am not, but I would love to be familiarized with it. If there's, I don't know if there's a link available, but if Jean can send a link or post a link, that would be wonderful. If it's something that has to be looked up, I'm happy to do that too. I would be fascinated to read that.
Okay. Well, since that was a short answer, I'm going to do one last question. And that is, you've already told us that the question, what do we do next, isn't really answerable. But for those, besides the book we're discussing tonight, and maybe one of your previous books, especially How to Be a Muslim, can you recommend any other sources in any format for non-Muslims to start thinking about the right things to help them understand better this faith-based traditions?
Sure. So I'm mindful of the fact that everyone learns in different ways.
Yeah.
And there are different resources and so on and so forth. Certainly there's a lot of good books out there, but I'll give a little Cincinnati plug. One of the key figures behind a Muslim-run, kind of Muslim-themed film and media company, Unity Productions Foundation, is from an old Muslim family with deep roots in Cincinnati. And if you look them up, Unity Productions Foundation, they've made a number of documentaries and films on all kinds of topics and subjects. So, just as a sample, they have a documentary about the Hajj pilgrimage following pilgrims going to Mecca, giving you a flavor of Muslim religious life on an international scale. They did a brilliant animated film about a Syrian girl who is orphaned and arrives in Europe as a refugee, and how she turns to Rumi and poetry to basically find some connection to her past in a really scary time, and what it's like to confront Islamophobia and the injustices that vulnerable populations often face, wittingly or not. And a new project they're working on, which looks really cool, is actually follows, it's an American Muslim road trip, and basically travels across the country to take little vignettes of, or present little vignettes of American Muslims and the different types of communities we have, from Anchorage, which is, I believe, the world's northernmost mosque, to old Muslim communities in the Southwest, to the incredibly large immigrant populations in LA and New York. It's just it's a very fun kind of concept, and it's a very American concept, right? What's more American than a road trip? And I feel like their work is nice because, one, film is pretty easy to digest, and two, there's just a lot of different stuff there for people who are interested in different things, and captures a lot of the incredible diversity of a very diverse community.
Great. Well, thank you. I think you've already filled in a lot of gaps in my own knowledge, and I think the recommendations you just made will be very helpful for a lot of the people in our audience tonight, myself included.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So before we all come back to say goodbye, Kristen and I are going to say a little bit about each of our institutions. So we'll start with a sincere thanks to you, and then I'm going to tell you more about, a reminder that we should all, those of us who don't have it yet, get a copy of this book. It's really, really interesting read, and I learned a lot from it.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move to the State Library of Massachusetts. So after a long pandemic closure, the Massachusetts State House and the State Library of Massachusetts are now back open to the public, and we hope that all of you, all of you, including our speaker tonight, will feel welcome to visit us. And we invite our viewers today to start with our website to learn about our resources, our services, and our great collections. And to get started, you can type in a simple version of our URL, like mass.gov/lib, and that will take you right to our homepage. So you can see from this slide that our collections at the State Library cover a wide variety of formats and topics, although most of our holdings document the history of Massachusetts and its government. But we have so much more. We have a large amount of material relating to the Commonwealth, much of it available through our digital repository. And you can find all those links on our website, and they should also be in the chat. So let's move to the last slide for us. We have one more virtual author talk on the schedule for the spring, and that will be on Monday, June 20th at 6 p.m., the day that many of us in the United States honor Juneteenth. We'll have a conversation with Annette Gordon-Reed on her book on Juneteenth. This event will be in collaboration with American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, the Boston Public Library, and GBH Forum Network. And you can find the link to register for this talk on our website and in the chat. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. And we'll go back to Kristen to close us out for the night. So Kristen?
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you, Haroon, for sharing your book with us. And just a reminder, you can check your local library for your copy or order from our bookstore partners at Trident, and we'll put that information in the chat again before we leave today. Just a reminder about the Boston Public Library. We have resources, services, and programs for people of all ages, both in person and online, and you can find out more at bpl.org. 2 upcoming talks that we have in June, which you might be interested in. We have the 2022 Drooper Award with local chef and restaurateur Barbara Lynch. She'll be here on Saturday, June 4th at 2 p.m. That is an in-person event only. And on Wednesday evening, June 8th, both in person here at the Central Library and online, you can sign up for that as well. It's our last Lowell lecture in the 2022 series with Dr. Eddie Glaudy Jr. And both Barbara Lynch and Dr. Glaudy Jr. will be in conversation with BPL President David Leonard. So we hope you'll enjoy. We hope you'll join us for one of these programs, or we'll see you at one of our locations soon. Thank you again for joining us, and take care.